If you're looking for the latest news, insight into what it means, and the sharpest opinion, there's only one station in Chicago where you can turn, and it's this one. We're AM 560. The Answer.
Good morning, Dan and Amy, and California's done it again. We talked a little bit yesterday about the elimination of fossil fuels by 2045, so dictated by Governor Moonbeam, Yeah, wouldn't want to pay the electricity bills in California, although I wouldn't want to pay the property taxes in Illinois either, but I do. And then they've got this. Here's one of the places identity politics ends, or I shouldn't say ends, consumes. Legislation passed by the California State Senate last month and the Assembly requires companies to appoint one woman to their boards of directors by the end of 2019. By the end of 2021, a 5-member board would need to have 2 women, while boards with 6 or more directors would need 3.
See, that's what's wrong.
No,
in this world.
What's wrong?
No, we should earn it.
Well, I thought you were getting to what's wrong is the obvious thing. What do you mean by woman, Dan? I'm so glad you asked. Because the legislature in California, in their infinite wisdom, defined that for us. Female is an individual who self-identifies her gender as a woman without regard to the individual's designated sex at birth. So, of course, they've got that ground covered. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So
transgenders are popping up everywhere.
That's
on the board of directors.
Yeah, that's got to be music to the ears of the Mountain View Mafia. Well, I'm sure they love the government dictating to them the composition of their boards of directors. For more on this topic and so many more, we're pleased to be joined by Ramesh Ponnuru, who, of course, is a columnist for Bloomberg View, as well as senior editor for National Review. Ramesh, before we get into the week that was for Judge Kavanaugh, how about that development in California, this innovation?
Yeah, well, it's, of course it happened in California. And it is an attempt to not just affect California residents, but really to transform American business. And you got to wonder whether it's going to survive a legal challenge for that reason.
Yeah, but it doesn't say, force people to use a certain source of energy. Doesn't that seem illegal?
Well, I think the key question would be whether the state is sort of, is basically transgressing on federalism because it's taking, it's trying to basically set a national policy. Conservatives, we tend to think of federalism as something that the federal government interferes with and tramples on the states, but it's equally bad when the states try to do something as though they're the federal government.
Well, there you go. Quotas, energy policy, these are all matters that could be taken up by the high court in some form or fashion, depending on what actually makes its way into law. And so the Kavanaugh hearings last week, concluding with the witness testimony, your takeaway in terms of how Brett Kavanaugh stood up and his likelihood of confirmation?
Well, I think he did exceptionally well. I think he was unflappable in circumstances that would have been difficult for most people. The circus-like atmosphere at the beginning and then the nasty personal attacks that increasingly dominated the Democratic questioning. None of it really threw him off his stride. There were 1 or 2 times where he seemed not to understand what the Democrats were trying to get at, but that I think was understandable because some of what they were doing was so strange. I think that he is on track to confirmation, and I think that the fact the Democrats were reduced to coming up with these kind of ridiculous character-based attacks on Kavanaugh is a sign of the desperation that they have over his nomination.
Not to mention references to Kirk Douglas movies. That's sort of the last act of a desperate man, isn't it?
Senator Cory Booker, I really think, I'm not a Democratic presidential primary voter, so I'm not going to say how this is playing with his intended audience. But for everybody else, it sure seems as though Senator beclowned himself by pulling this ridiculous stunt and pretending that he was some sort of hero in disclosing classified information, which turned out not to be particularly important or classified. But if that's the kind of theater that the Democratic primary voters respond to, I guess it will have been worth it for him.
Well, do you think it's time to end these confirmation hearings? I mean, they turn into a circus show. They had, almost 90 people arrested during the Kavanaugh hearing?
We didn't have Supreme Court confirmation hearings for most of U.S. history. And, it may be that there was a time and a place where it made sense, and under today's extreme partisanship, it doesn't. There were some exchanges that made sense and that were interesting and enlightening. I think Senator Cruz and Senator Lee and Senator Sass on the Republican side did a very good job of asking questions. And I think that even on the Democratic side, the ones who weren't running for president, Senator Coons of Delaware and Senator Klobuchar of Minnesota, who I don't think is running for president, although you sometimes hear talk about that. I think they did a creditable job, but the circus and the innuendo were real black marks on the Senate.
Speaking of those senators and zeroing in on Ben Sass, what was your reaction to his remark over the weekend that, he thinks about leaving the Republican Party and just being unaffiliated as United States Senator every day because of the reality TV show that is the Trump administration and the melodrama associated with Trump's inner sanctum, if you will. Is that wise for Sass? Does that signal a frustration within Republican ranks that will negatively translate in the midterms?
Well, I think that the frustration that Senator Sass feels is widely shared among his colleagues. I am generally an admirer of the senator. It is certainly true that there are other voters in that same boat. So, there do seem to have been some departures from the Republican Party in the population at large over the last few years. That said, I think that either you do it or you don't, but there's no point in making a big public display about agonizing over it.
Well, and the interesting thing, too, is even those that have expressed frustration with Trump previously have had sort of hot and cold relationships with him. It's interesting to see how some of them have come around. I mean, I can't help but immediately think of Lindsey Graham, and even with how close he was to McCain, Lindsey Graham has been stalwart for Trump with respect to an investigation that he gave a lot of latitude to, which is the Mueller investigation, and talking even this past weekend about this anonymous op-ed emanating from the Trump administration within it, allegedly, is indicative of how little they have, the left and Mueller, in terms of evidence of Russian collusion and any substantive outcome from this investigation. So it's just really interesting to see somebody like Lindsey Graham running interference for Trump when others like Sass are not.
Yeah, well, and Graham has gone so far as to suggest that he would be open to replacing Jeff Sessions as Attorney General so that Trump could have an AG that he has confidence in. And Graham speaks for a lot of Republicans, too. I mean, there are a lot of Republicans who have found their estimation of President Trump increasing over the last several years and whose reservations have melted away over that time.
Your reaction to President Obama taking credit for the economy's performance under President Trump when he spoke at U of I last week?
So I think that, I go back to the old-fashioned conservative view that we tend to exaggerate the role of presidents in determining the performance of the economy. I don't think that it's all to Obama's credit, but I also don't think it's all to Trump's credit. I think that, we have a great big economy with scores of millions of private economic actors, and politicians tend to overestimate their own importance in all of it. That said, I do think that there are a couple of things that President Trump has done with congressional Republicans that are going to exert, that have exerted and are going to continue to exert a positive influence on the economy. I think on balance, the tax cut is a positive for the economy. I wish it weren't quite as much deficit financed as it is. The deregulation and the regulatory restraint in general should also be expected to raise the level of economic activity over the years. So I think that the president has legitimate bragging rights. And then, at the end of the day, regardless of the merits of this and the political back and forth, if you've got a good economy, the president and his party tend to get credit for it politically.
He is Ramesh Ponnuru, columnist for Bloomberg View, senior editor for National Review. Ramesh, thanks for joining us again. Appreciate it.
You're welcome. Take care.
You too.
And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.